The sky above the capital city of Ethelgard was not blue, nor was it the bruised purple of dusk. It was the color of iron, choked by a swarm of surveillance drones that buzzed like a plague of mechanical locusts. They hovered in tight, mathematical formations, their lenses swiveling to capture every angle of the colossal broadcast arena below. This was the Unity Plaza, a bowl of white stone and polished steel capable of holding 200,000 citizens. Today, every seat was filled. The roar of the crowd was a physical weight, a rhythmic chant that vibrated through the floor of the holding cell beneath the stage. They were screaming for justice. They were screaming for blood. Elias Thorne sat on the edge of his cot, listening to the muffled thunder of his own death sentence. He did not look like a man about to die. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed transport. His hands, scarred and thick with callus, rested loosely on his knees. The standard-issue prisoner-grade jumpsuit fit poorly over his broad shoulders, tight across the chest where a dozen medals had once hung. 3 months ago, Elias had been the poster boy for the Imperial expansion. He was the hero of the border wars, the man who had secured the silicon moons of Sector 9. Now, according to the 300-foot holographic screens dominating the city skyline, he was the butcher of Kaleida, a traitor. A man who had sabotaged the glorious peace talks to line his own pockets with off-world currency. It was a lie, of course. But in the Empire, the truth was not what happened. The truth was whatever the Ministry of Information decided to broadcast between the weather report and the sports scores. The heavy magnetic lock on his cell door hissed and disengaged. A guard stepped in. It was Jansen, a man with a soft face and tired eyes who had been bringing Elias his nutrient paste for the last 3 weeks. Jansen looked more terrified than the prisoner. He kept glancing at the camera in the corner of the ceiling. "Time to go." "Thorne," Jansen said, his voice cracking slightly. Elias stood up. He stretched his neck, hearing the vertebrae pop. "Is it a full house out there, Jansen?" Elias asked. Jansen nodded, swallowing hard. "The numbers are record-breaking. They say half the system is tuning in. The Emperor wants everyone to see this." Elias smirked. It was a grim, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. They always like a show. It keeps them from asking why the grain rations are half the size they were last year. Jansen stepped back to let Elias pass into the corridor. 2 elite peacekeepers, armored in white plastoid that made them look like faceless statues, fell in behind him. They did not speak. They simply leveled their shock rifles at his spine. As they walked down the long, sterile hallway toward the lift that would raise him to the execution platform, Jansen walked beside him, struggling with protocol. "You have a right to the final statement," Jansen mumbled, reciting the regulation, "and the final request. Within reason, no transport, no communications." "I know the rules," Elias said. He stopped walking just before the lift doors. The peacekeepers tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. Elias turned to Jansen. "I submitted my request to the tribunal this morning. Did they approve it?" Jansen looked down at his datapad. He frowned. "It is highly irregular." "Thorne, the ministry thinks it is a joke. They think you are trying to mock the dignity of the court." "Dignity," Elias repeated. He looked at the white armor of the peacekeepers, then back to the nervous guard. "I am being executed for a crime the High Admiral committed. I think we are past dignity. Did they approve it or not?" Jansen tapped the screen. "They approved it. The director of broadcasting thinks it will make for excellent theater. He called it a symbol of imperial dominance over the primitive." Elias exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to empty his lungs of all the stale prison air. Good. That is all I need. What is it? Jansen asked, looking at the file again, puzzled by the code. What is Subject 7? Elias stepped into the lift. He looked straight ahead as the doors began to slide shut. Not a what? Jansen? A who? The lift rose rapidly, the sensation of gravity increasing threefold. Above him, the noise of the crowd grew from a rumble to a deafening roar. Elias closed his eyes and let the darkness take him back. He needed to be back there, just for a moment, to remember why he was standing here. He was back on the frozen frontier of the rim worlds. The wind there did not just blow, it cut. It was a jagged landscape of ice spires and black rock, where the Empire maintained its black site laboratories. He had been leading a sweep and clear mission. The intel said rebels had taken over a research station. The intel was wrong. The station had not been taken by rebels. It had been breached by its own experiments. Elias remembered the smell of the corridor, burnt wiring, copper blood, and the musk of something wild. His squad had been dead before they hit the ground, torn apart by shadows that moved faster than the human eye could track. Elias had cornered the beast in the main reactor room. It was huge, standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with fur the color of a starless night and eyes that burned with a pale violet luminescence. It was wolf-like, but no wolf born of nature had plating of biological armor fused to its spine, or a neural harness drilled directly into its skull. He had his rifle aimed at its heart. The creature was wounded, bleeding a glowing blue fluid from a gash in its flank. It snarled, a sound that vibrated in Elias's teeth. Then, a voice had cut through the freezing air. "Do not shoot!" Elias had spun around, weapon raised. Standing on the catwalk above was a woman. She wore a white lab coat stained with soot and grime. Her hair was stark white, pulled back in a severe knot, and her eyes were sharp, cold, and utterly terrifying. "That is government property. Commander," she had said, her voice calm despite the carnage around them. "If you damage it, the cost will come out of your pension." Elias had looked from the woman to the beast. "It killed my men." Elias had shouted, "No!" She corrected him, walking down the stairs with a data pad in hand. "The programming killed your men. The animal is just the hardware." She walked right past him, stepping between the barrel of his rifle and the snarling monster. Elias watched in disbelief as she held out a hand. She did not flinch when the creature snapped its jaws inches from her fingers. "He is afraid," she said softly. She looked at Elias then. That was the first time he had truly seen Lyra. She was beautiful in the way a glacier is beautiful, impressive, dangerous, and cold. "You are a soldier," she said. "You follow orders. So does he. Do you blame the rifle for the bullet?" Elias lowered his weapon. The logic was cold, but it held. The creature had collapsed then, the adrenaline fading. Elias had helped her carry the massive weight of the beast to the med bay. Over the next 3 weeks waiting for extraction. Elias had spent every shift in that bay. He watched Lyra work. She was a xenobiologist, a handler for the Empire's living weapon program. But she hated it. He saw it in the way she touched the creature when she thought the cameras were off. She didn't treat it like hardware. She treated it like a victim. One night, during a blizzard that buried the station in 20 feet of snow, they shared a bottle of synthetic whiskey. "His name is not Subject 7, she had told him, her eyes glassy with drink and fatigue. "What is it?" Elias asked. She leaned in, whispering as if the walls had ears. "The natives of this moon call them ghost stalkers. They are telepathic." Elias, bonding packs. The Empire staples these harnesses to their brains to force obedience, to make them kill on command. But underneath the code, he is still in there. Elias looked at the sleeping wolf. Can he be saved? Lyra looked at Elias, and for a moment, the ice in her eyes cracked. Only if someone is willing to be torn apart to do it. The lift stopped with a heavy thud. The doors opened, and the light blinded him. Elias stepped out onto the execution platform. It was a circular dais raised 50 feet above the arena floor. The noise hit him like a physical blow. 200,000 people screaming traitor and death. He blinked against the glare of the spotlights. He saw the high tribunal seated in a luxury box to his right, draped in red velvet and gold. He saw the drones dipping low, their cameras zooming in to catch the sweat on his brow. He did not sweat. He walked to the center of the platform where the magnetic shackles waited. He placed his wrists in them. They clamped shut with a mechanical whine, locking him in place. A silence fell over the arena, engineered by the master of ceremonies. A booming voice echoed from the speakers. Citizens of the Empire, we stand today to witness justice. The crowd roared again, then hushed. Elias Thorne, once a captain, now a disgrace. You have been sentenced to termination for crimes against the state. Do you have any final words before the sentence is carried out? Elias looked up at the camera drone hovering 3 feet from his face. He saw his own reflection in the lens. He looked tired. I have no words, Elias said, his voice amplified across the city. But I have a request. The High Adjudicator, a fat man with a beard that looked like oiled wire, leaned forward in the luxury box. The court has granted this request, the adjudicator boomed, sounding bored. Let it be shown that the Empire is merciful, even to dogs. Bring out the beast. The massive blast doors at the far end of the arena ground open. The crowd gasped. From the darkness of the tunnel, a creature emerged. It was magnificent and terrifying. It moved with a liquid grace, muscles rippling under fur that shimmered like oil on water. It was the size of a small transport vehicle, its paws silent on the white stone. A heavy neural harness was clamped around its neck, glowing with a malevolent red light. Chains thick as a man's arm trailed from the harness, held by 4 handlers in armored suits. It was the wolf from the ice moon. But it looked wrong. Its eyes were wild, darting frantically. It was emaciated, its ribs showing through the silver-black fur. Elias felt a sharp pang in his chest. They had starved him. The handlers dragged the wolf toward the center of the arena. The creature snapped and snarled, pulling against the chains with enough force to drag the men across the stone. The crowd loved it. They cheered for the monster. They wanted to see it tear the traitor apart. Wait. The voice was not amplified, but it cut through the noise with razor-sharp precision. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the tunnel, walking behind the handlers. The crowd murmured, "Who was this?" It was a woman. She wore the high-collared silk robes of a royal custodian, a position of immense legal immunity. Her hair was no longer in a severe bun but flowed down her back like a river of white gold. Lyra. She walked with a terrifying confidence, ignoring the jeers of the crowd. She walked straight to the handlers. "Release the chains," she ordered. The lead handler, a man with a shock baton, laughed. "Lady, this is a Class 5 predator. If we release the chains, he eats everyone in the front row." "I said release them," Lyra said. She held up a data slate. "By order of the Interspecies Ethics Treaty, Section 42, Subsection 9. I lay claim to this biological asset as its primary genetic custodian. The animal is under my command." The High Adjudicator stood up in his box. "This is highly irregular. Who is this woman?" Lyra looked up at the box. Her face was projected onto the giant screens. She was stunning, and the camera loved her. I am Lyra Vane, former lead xenobiologist of the Frontier Division, and I am exercising my right to oversee the final interaction between the prisoner and the asset. Unless the High Adjudicator wishes to violate a treaty that keeps the Trade Federation from blockading our food supplies. The threat hung in the air. The Empire needed the trade routes. They could not afford a diplomatic incident over a dog show. The Adjudicator sat down, his face purple. Allow it, he hissed. But if that beast kills anyone other than the prisoner, execute the woman too. Lyra turned back to the handlers. Go. The handlers looked at each other, then unclipped the heavy chains. They backed away slowly, weapons raised. The wolf was loose. Elias stood frozen in his shackles. He watched the wolf. He watched Lyra. She did not look at the wolf. She looked at him. Their eyes met across the 50 feet of white stone. In that look, there was 3 years of silence. There was the memory of the whiskey in the medbay. There was the heat of an argument they had the night he left, where she told him he was a fool for trusting the command, and he told her she was a cynic who believed in nothing. She looked different, harder, but her eyes were still the same, intelligent and burning with a secret fire. She nodded, a microscopic movement. The wolf turned its massive head. It saw Elias. The red light on its collar pulsed faster. The aggression protocols were spiking. The crowd went silent, anticipating the lunge. Kill! The Adjudicator shouted into the microphone. The wolf charged. It crossed the arena floor in 3 seconds, a blur of black motion. Elias did not flinch. He did not close his eyes. He watched his death coming. The wolf launched itself into the air, jaws open, teeth gleaming like obsidian daggers. The crowd screamed in delight, but the jaws did not snap shut. The wolf landed with heavy impact, its front paws hitting Elias's chest, pinning him against the pillar of the shackles. But instead of tearing out his throat, the creature let out a low, mournful whine. It pressed its massive forehead against Elias's chest. It rubbed its face against the rough fabric of the prison jumpsuit. Smelling him. Recognizing him. Elias leaned his head forward, resting his forehead against the beast's snout. "Hello, boy," Elias whispered. The wolf made a sound that was halfway between a growl and a purr. It refused to attack. It stood on its hind legs, its paws on his shoulders, shielding him from the cameras. The crowd was confused. This was not the blood sport they had been promised. In the luxury box, the Adjudicator was screaming. Override the collar. Shock it. Make it kill him. Lyra was moving. While the arena watched the wolf, she had closed the distance. She stepped up to the dais, moving into the shadow of the beast. She stood next to Elias. She smelled of expensive perfume and ozone. "You always were dramatic." "Elias," she murmured, not moving her lips. "You took your time," he replied, looking at the wolf, not her. "Traffic was terrible," she said. She reached out, ostensibly to pull the wolf away. Her hand brushed Elias's shackled wrist. He felt a sharp prick, then a cold sensation sliding under the metal of the cuff. A data shard. "Hold this," she whispered. "Do not lose it. It contains the flight logs from the peace talks. The ones they said were destroyed." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. "You kept them?" "I stole them," she corrected. "And they are going to kill us for it." The wolf suddenly stiffened. The red light on its collar turned a solid, blinding crimson. "They are overriding the safety," Lyra said, her voice losing its cool edge. The wolf threw its head back. It did not attack Elias. It did not attack Lyra. It opened its jaws and howled. It was not a sound of nature. It was a sound of mechanics and biology screaming in unison. The howl hit a frequency that human ears could barely register, but it was agony. Glass shattered in the luxury box. The hovering drones began to wobble. Their navigation lights flickered. The giant screens surrounding the arena distorted, the image of the traitor dissolving into static and jagged lines of code. One by one, the iron insects fell from the sky, crashing into the stands. The broadcast feed cut out. The arena plunged into chaos, and in the center of the storm, the wolf stood guard, its violet eyes glowing, waiting for the command that would change everything. The static on the giant screens did not last. The Empire's redundancy systems kicked in with a mechanical screech, rerouting power from the city grid to stabilize the broadcast. The image flickered back to life, showing the chaotic scene on the execution platform, the traitor standing unbound, the woman in her shimmering robes, and the massive alien wolf bristling with lethal energy. "Kill them," the High Adjudicator shrieked, his voice cracking over the arena speakers. "Kill them all immediately. Cut the feed." The 4 handlers who had released the chains raised their shock rifles. They were professionals, trained to put down rebellious biological assets. But they hesitated. They were not looking at an animal. They were looking at a storm trapped in fur and muscle. Lyra did not flinch. She tapped a sequence into the jeweled bracelet on her left wrist. It looked like a simple adornment, rubies set in platinum, but it was a disguised transmitter broadcasting on a dead frequency. "Wake up," she whispered. The red light on the wolf's collar blinked out. For a microsecond, the harness went dark. Then, it flared a brilliant, piercing white. The override code Lyra had spent 3 years hunting down, a ghost string of numbers deleted from the central archives, slammed into the collar's receiver. It did not just disable the shock mechanism, it unlocked the limiter on the creature's nervous system. The wolf moved. To the human eye, it was a blur. To Elias, whose reflexes were honed by decades of frontier warfare, it was poetry. The creature did not lunge with the clumsy aggression of a beast. It flowed. It dropped low, sweeping its tail to knock the legs out from under the first handler. As the man fell, the wolf spun, snapping the barrel of the second handler's rifle with a single, precise bite. There was no blood. The wolf was not mauling, it was disarming. It tossed the third handler into the fourth with the casual ease of a child discarding a toy. On the dais, the Minister of Protocol, a man whose entire career had been built on the precise measurement of bowing angles and ceremonial ribbon cutting, stood frozen. He looked at the wolf, which was now panting softly 3 feet away from him. The creature looked up, its violet eyes boring into the man's soul. The minister made a high, squeaking sound, clutched his chest, and fainted dead away, his silk robes billowing around him like a deflated parachute. It was a moment of absurdity in the center of a nightmare. Elias felt a hand on his arm. "Stop admiring the view," Lyra said. Her voice was tight, vibrating with adrenaline. She grabbed his wrist. She twisted the large sapphire ring on her right hand, and a focused laser beam, no thicker than a hair, shot out. With surgical precision, she sliced through the magnetic lock of his shackles. The metal clattered to the white stone floor. Elias rubbed his wrists, the sensation of freedom rushing through him like intoxicant. "You are full of surprises, Lyra," he said, his voice rough. "We are leaving," she snapped. "7, on me." The wolf, 7, fell into step beside her instantly. The crowd in the stands was in an uproar, a mix of panic and thrill-seeking hysteria. Drones were beginning to circle back, their weapons charging. "Where are we going?" Elias asked, dodging a stun blast that scorched the stone near his foot. "Down," Lyra said. She led them not toward the tunnel, but to the edge of the platform. Beneath the execution dais was a ventilation chasm, a sheer drop of 200 feet into the industrial bowels of the city. "Trust me?" she asked, looking at him. "Do I have a choice?" Elias replied. "No." She jumped. Elias cursed and followed her. The wolf leaped after them, a dark comet against the gray air. They landed on a heavy mesh safety net 50 feet down, the impact knocking the wind out of Elias. He rolled, instinctively checking for broken bones. Lyra was already moving, scrambling off the net onto a rusted service catwalk. The wolf landed with a grace that defied physics, barely shaking the mesh. They were in the Undercity now. The air here tasted of recycled ozone, burnt grease, and the metallic tang of old coolant. Huge pipes, large enough to drive a transport truck through, wove through the darkness like the intestines of a giant machine. The roar of the arena was a dull throb above them. "This way," Lyra commanded, pulling a small glow rod from her robes. They ran. Elias fell into a rhythm he had not used in years, the steady, ground-eating lope of deep reconnaissance. He watched Lyra. She was not a soldier, but she moved with a desperate determination, hiking up her expensive robes to sprint along the grating. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they lock down the sector," she called back over her shoulder. "Who is chasing us?" Elias asked, his breath coming easily despite the exertion. "Standard peacekeepers," Lyra laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I wish. The adjudicator has authorized the deployment of the Truth Knights." Elias missed a step. He grabbed the railing to steady himself. "The Truth Knights? For a failed execution? That is excessive. They are not here for you." "Elias," Lyra said, taking a sharp left turn into a narrow maintenance tunnel. "They are here for the wolf." They ran for another mile, descending deeper into the city's roots. The pristine white stone of the Capitol was gone, replaced by dripping concrete and graffiti that glowed in the dark. Behind them, far up in the vertical shaft, a sound echoed. It was the heavy, rhythmic clang of magnetic boots on metal. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. "They are tracking the harness," Elias said. "We need to cut it off him. If we cut it off..." "His brain liquefies," Lyra said, not slowing down. "It is fused to his brainstem." I jammed the tracking signal. But the Knights have thermal optics that can see a heat signature through 3 feet of lead. They burst into a large, cavernous space. It was an abandoned hollow theater from the pre-expansion era. Rows of dusty velvet seats stretched back into the darkness. On the stage, a malfunctioning projector was stuck in a loop, displaying a flickering, ghostly image of a happy family eating synthetic roast chicken. "In here," Lyra hissed, pushing Elias toward the back of the theater. They scrambled over the seats, ducking behind a heavy debris barrier formed by a collapsed balcony. The wolf curled up tight, making himself as small as possible. Elias pressed his back against the cold wall, listening. The footsteps had stopped. He looked at Lyra. She was trembling, not from fear, he realized, but from the crash of adrenaline. She was trying to unfasten her heavy ceremonial collar, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. "Let me," Elias said. He reached out, his hands steady. He undid the clasp and pulled the heavy silk garment away, revealing a practical tactical suit worn underneath. She looked at him, her chest heaving. In the flickering light of the hollow projector, her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark. "Why did you do it?" Elias asked. His voice was low. "You had a life. Lyra, you were safe. You were rich. Why throw it away for a dead man?" "I did not do it for you," she whispered, defensive anger flashing in her eyes. "I did it because they were going to dissect him." She gestured to the wolf. Elias looked at the beast. The wolf was watching them, its head resting on its paws. Its eyes moved back and forth between the man and the woman with an intelligence that was unsettling. You risked execution for a lab experiment? Elias asked. He is not an experiment, Lyra snapped. She moved closer to Elias, crowding his personal space. He is a person, Elias, a person who happens to have 4 legs and fur. And he is the only one in this entire godforsaken city who has never lied to me. Elias stared at her. They were close now, breathing the same stale air. The danger outside, the truth nights, the drones, the execution order seemed to fade, replaced by the immediate magnetic pull of their history. He remembered the nights on the ice moon. He remembered the way she had looked at him when he boarded the transport ship, leaving her behind. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His skin was rough against her smoothness. You are a terrible liar. Lyra Vane, he said softly. You came back for me too. Lyra did not pull away. Her breath hitched. She looked at his mouth, then up to his eyes. The tension between them was a physical force, a wire pulled so tight it hummed. Maybe I just wanted to see if you were still as stubborn as I remembered, she murmured. Elias leaned in. The distance between them closed to inches. He could smell the fear on her, and beneath it, the scent of lavender and rain. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to kiss her more than he wanted to breathe. A heavy boom shook the theater. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The wolf growled, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Elias pulled back, the soldier taking over the man instantly. They are sweeping the grid, he said, checking the power levels on the field cutter Lyra had given him. We cannot stay here. Lyra took a deep breath, composing herself. She smoothed her hair, the mask of the cool scientist sliding back into place. You are right. We need to move. But first, you need to know what you are really caught up in. She pulled a small holographic projector from her belt and set it on the floor. A map of the galaxy sprang to life, hovering in the blue light. The peace talks were not sabotaged by you, Elias. They were sabotaged by the Ares faction. Elias frowned. The Ares faction was a myth, a rumored cabal of militarists within the Admiralty. They are not a myth, Lyra said, anticipating his doubt. They are very real, and they need a war. The economy is stalling. The expansion has stopped. Without a new conflict, the military budget gets cut by 40%. They needed the peace talks to fail so they could justify annexing the neutral systems of the Veil Nebula. And I was the convenient patsy, Elias said, the pieces falling into place. You were perfect, Lyra said grimly. A hero, a legend. If even Elias Thorne could turn traitor, then the enemy must be truly insidious. It terrified the public. It made them beg for protection. She pointed to the wolf. And this is their endgame. Subject 7. He is not just a wolf. He is a prototype for the Sentient Asset Division. They want to create an army of them. Creatures with the intelligence of a human tactical commander and the lethality of an apex predator. Elias looked at the wolf. The creature blinked slowly, but there was a flaw. Lyra continued. To make them smart enough to take complex orders, they had to leave the emotional centers of the brain intact. They tried to suppress it with the harness, but the biology fought back. The wolves went insane. They killed their handlers. Except for him, Elias said. Except for him, Lyra agreed. Because I did something illegal. She knelt beside the wolf, burying her hands in his thick fur. I used an empathic bonding ritual from the natives of the ice moon. The Empire banned it 200 years ago. It links 2 nervous systems. It creates a feedback loop of emotion. He stays sane because I anchor him. He feels what I feel. Elias stared at her in shock. You bonded with him? That is considered witchcraft by the tribunal. It is science, Lyra corrected. Just science they do not understand. If I die, he goes mad. If he dies, I probably suffer a massive cerebral hemorrhage. We are a package deal. Elias sat back against the dusty seat. The magnitude of what she had done was staggering. She had tied her life to a beast to save it from madness. So that is your secret, he said. Now tell me mine. Lyra looked at him, confused. What? You asked me why I surrendered, Elias said. Why I let them call me a traitor without fighting back. I assumed they drugged you, Lyra said, or threatened your family. But you have no family. I have a sister, Elias said quietly. She runs an orphanage in the lower districts. The Ares faction took them. 40 children. They told me if I said a word in my defense, they would vent the orphanage's life support. Lyra's hand went to her mouth. Oh, Elias, I had to die. Lyra, it was the only way to ensure they would let the children go. But you did not die, Lyra said, her voice rising in panic. I stopped it. I ruined the deal. Elias nodded grimly. Yes, which means the children are dead unless we can prove my innocence before the news cycle resets. The weight of the situation settled on them. They were not just running for their lives, they were running for 40 others. We need the original data, Lyra said, her mind racing. The shard I gave you has the flight logs. But it is not enough. We need the biological records from the lab on the frontier. We need to prove that the Ares faction was breeding these wolves for war long before the peace talks began. The lab was destroyed, Elias said. The physical lab was, Lyra said. But the backup archive is on the moon of Mnemosyne. It is a neutral archive world. The treaty logs and the black budget receipts are stored there in a hardened vault. Mnemosyne is 3 light systems away, Elias said. We have no ship. We have no credits. And every face scanner in the city is looking for us. Lyra stood up. A dangerous smile played on her lips. It was the smile of the woman who had walked into a cage with a monster. We do not need credits, Elias. We have you. You are the best infiltrator in the fleet. Can you steal a ship? Elias stood up. He checked the charge on the field cutter. I can steal anything that flies. Getting to the spaceport was a lesson in terror. They moved through the sewers, wading through waist-deep sludge to avoid the patrols. The wolf hated the water, whining softly. But he stayed close to Lyra's leg. They emerged in the cargo district of the orbital lift station. It was a forest of shipping containers and robotic loaders. The Truth Knights were close. Elias could hear the whine of their heavy assault bikes echoing off the container walls. There, Elias pointed. Sitting on a launch pad, fueling up for a night run, was a sleek courier vessel. It was a Starling-class jumper, small, fast, and lightly armed. It has a biometric lock, Lyra whispered as they crouched behind a crate of synthetic grain. And a pilot. Elias picked up a heavy wrench from a discarded toolbox. I will handle the pilot. You handle the lock. He moved before she could argue. Elias slipped through the shadows, moving with a silence that made him seem like a ghost. He approached the pilot, who was checking the landing struts. One strike. Precise. Controlled. The pilot crumpled. Elias caught him before he hit the ground and dragged him into the shadows. He waved Lyra forward. She sprinted across the tarmac, the wolf at her heels. She reached the airlock. The panel glowed red. It is a DNA cipher, she cursed, her fingers flying over the keypad. Bypass it, Elias said, watching the perimeter. I am trying. It is military-grade encryption. A spotlight swept over them. Hey! A voice shouted from the control tower. Halt! Alarms began to blare. The wail was deafening. "Lyra!" Elias shouted. "I got it!" The airlock hissed open. They threw themselves inside. The wolf scrambled in last, his claws sparking on the metal deck. Elias slammed the manual override for the door. He jumped into the pilot's seat. The controls were familiar, standard Imperial layout. "Strap in," he yelled. He punched the ignition sequence. The engines roared to life, a comforting vibration that shook the deck plates. Outside, the blast doors of the cargo bay were closing. The Truth Knights had arrived. 3 massive armored figures stood on the tarmac, leveling heavy cannons at the ship. "Hold on," Elias gritted out. He threw the throttle forward. The ship lurched, tearing through the refueling hoses. Fuel sprayed onto the tarmac and ignited, creating a wall of fire between them and the Knights. The ship shot upward, screaming toward the sky. The G-force slammed Elias back into his seat. He fought the stick, guiding them through the traffic lanes, dodging heavy freighters and advertising blimps. Warning. The ship's computer intoned, its voice calm and synthetic. Unsanctioned launch detected. Surface-to-air missiles locking on. "Flare countermeasures," Elias ordered, his hands dancing over the console. The ship bucked as explosions blossomed behind them. Shrapnel pinged off the hull like hail. Lyra was in the co-pilot seat, clutching the armrests until her knuckles were white. The wolf was strapped into the jump seat behind them, whining in distress. "We are punching through the atmosphere in 5 seconds," Elias shouted. The sky turned from iron gray to black. The stars exploded into view. Silence. The engine roar smoothed out into a steady hum. They were in orbit. Elias engaged the hyperdrive spool. "Course set from Namazin," he said, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding for an hour. Lyra leaned back, closing her eyes. "We made it." Elias tapped the communication console. Not quite. "Look," he brought up the Imperial news feed. The face on the screen was familiar. It was the High Adjudicator, looking disheveled but furious. "Citizens," he announced, his voice trembling with rage. "A dangerous terrorist cell has escaped custody. Elias Thorne, the traitor, Lyra Vane, the defecting scientist, and a rogue biological weapon. They are armed, unstable, and enemies of the state." A bounty amount flashed on the screen. It was a number so large it was meaningless to the average citizen. 50 million credits. Dead or alive. The adjudicator's eyes burned into the camera. "If you see them, do not approach. Contact the authorities immediately. The Empire will not rest until these monsters are destroyed." Elias turned off the screen. The cockpit was bathed in the soft blue light of the stars. "We are famous," he said dryly. Lyra looked at him, then at the wolf, who had managed to free himself from the straps and was now resting his head on her shoulder. "We are not monsters," she whispered. "No," Elias said, engaging the hyperdrive. The stars stretched into lines of light. "We are the only honest people left in the galaxy." The ship vanished into the void, leaving the Empire and its lies behind, but carrying the target on its back. The asteroid belt known as the Devil's Rosary was a graveyard of broken rocks and bad intentions. It was a chaotic swirl of debris orbiting a dying brown dwarf star, a place where the Empire's laws were treated as mild suggestions rather than absolute mandates. For Elias Thorne, Lyra Vane, and the massive wolf known as Subject 7, it was the only place to hide. Their stolen courier ship, now repainted a dull, rusted orange to blend in with the mining traffic, drifted into the docking clamp of Station 4. The station was carved directly into a nickel-iron asteroid the size of a mountain. It was a hive of smugglers, disgraced corporate spies, and flesh peddlers. "We need fuel, heavy coolant for the engine, and identity scramblers," Elias said, checking the charge on his stolen blaster. and we need them without flagging the local Imperial garrison. Lyra stood by the airlock, adjusting the high collar of a velvet coat she had fabricated from the ship's emergency blankets and a few spare synthesizer cycles. She had transformed herself. She was no longer the fugitive scientist. She was a bored, dangerous aristocrat from the core systems, slumming it in the outer rim for thrills. "Leave the talking to me," she said, applying a stripe of silver paint across her eyes. "You are just the hired muscle. Try to look large and stupid." Elias grunted. "That should not be difficult given how little I understand of your plan." Seven paced behind them. The wolf was agitated. His neural implant was sparking intermittently, sending small tremors through his massive frame. Lyra had draped a heavy cloak over his back to hide the worst of the cybernetics, but nothing could hide the sheer size of him or the violet glow of his eyes. "He stays close," Lyra commanded. "If anyone asks, he is a Canis Majoris show beast, very expensive, very temperamental." The airlock hissed open, and the smells of the station hit them like a physical wall. Fried spices, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of recycled oxygen. They stepped out into the bazaar. The main promenade of Station 4 was a riot of noise and color. Holographic advertisements for cheap liquor and illegal genetic mods flickered in the smoky air. The crowd was a dense river of humanity and aliens, pushing and shoving through the narrow corridors lined with stalls. Elias walked a half-step behind Lyra, his hand resting casually near the weapon concealed under his jacket. He scanned every face, every shadow. High above, hovering like annoying insects, were the facial recognition swarm drones. They were cheap models, erratic and buzzing, but dangerous enough if they got a clear lock on Elias's jawline. "Keep your head down," Elias murmured. Lyra did the opposite. She lifted her chin, striding through the muck of the street with an imperious sneer. "If we act like we are hiding, they will hunt us," she whispered back, not breaking her stride. "Predators do not hide. Elias, they parade." She stopped at a stall selling identity chips. The vendor, a cybernetically enhanced man with 3 mechanical eyes, looked them over with greedy calculation. "I need 3 grade A ghosts," Lyra said, tossing a stolen credit chip onto the counter. "Clean slates, no backtrace." The vendor picked up the chip. "This is Imperial military script," he said, his voice grating. "Hot money. Costs extra to wash it." Lyra leaned forward. She did not look worried. She looked bored. "Do not bore me with arithmetic. Just give me the chips, or my bodyguard will dismantle your stall. And then he will dismantle you." She gestured vaguely at Elias. Elias crossed his arms, letting his biceps bulge against the fabric of his flight suit. He gave the vendor a flat, dead-eyed stare that he had perfected during interrogations on the frontier. The vendor swallowed. He hurriedly swept the credit chip into a drawer and began encoding 3 blank slates. While the transaction took place, 7 became bored. The wolf had been tracking a scent for the last 100 yards. It was a rich, savory smell of roasting meat coming from a food cart directly across the aisle. The cart was piled high with skewers of lizard meat, sizzling over an open plasma grill. 7 nudged Elias's leg, but Elias was focused on the vendor. 7 decided to handle the matter himself. The wolf padded silently across the aisle. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the apex predator in their midst. 7 approached the food cart. The cook, a squat man with a greasy apron, had his back turned, arguing with a customer. 7 rose on his hind legs. He was taller than the cart. With delicate precision, he clamped his jaws around an entire rack of skewers, 20 pounds of spiced meat, and pulled it free. The metal rack clattered. The cook spun around. "Hey!" The cook screamed, brandishing a spatula. That beast stole my inventory. 7 dropped back to all fours, the rack of meat dangling from his mouth. He looked at the cook, then crunched down. Wood, metal, and meat vanished in 2 bites. The crowd went silent. Then, someone laughed. "Look at the appetite on that thing," a miner shouted. Elias spun around, his hand going for his gun, expecting a fight. Instead, he saw 7 licking his chops, looking incredibly pleased with himself. The cook was red-faced, raising his spatula to strike. 7 let out a low, vibrating growl. It was not loud, but it shook the dust off the overhead pipes. The cook froze, the spatula trembling in midair. Lyra turned, her transaction complete. She saw the scene and sighed, a perfect dramatic exhalation of a weary noblewoman. "Bad manners, darling," she drawled, addressing the wolf. She walked over to the terrified cook and flicked another credit chip onto his grill. It sizzled in the grease. "That should cover the lizard and the rack," she said. "Keep the change." The cook looked at the credit chip. It was worth more than his entire cart. "Thank you, my lady," he stammered. A fine beast, a magnificent beast. The crowd cheered. They loved a show, and they loved seeing money thrown around. 7, realizing he was the center of attention, gave a short, sharp bark that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "Let us move," Elias hissed, grabbing Lyra's elbow. "We are drawing a crowd." Lyra smiled at him, her eyes dancing with a mix of adrenaline and amusement. "We are blending in. Elias, no one looks for fugitives who are buying rounds of steak for the house." As they moved deeper into the station, toward the engineering sector, Elias found himself watching her. He watched the way the neon light caught the curve of her neck. He watched the confident sway of her hips that was half act and half Lyra. He was a man who had spent his life dealing in cold facts and hard targets. He understood trajectories, blast radii, and extraction protocols. He did not understand the way his chest tightened when she laughed at danger. He was angry at her for risking their cover. But beneath the anger was a hunger he had been trying to bury since the ice moon. She was brilliant. She was terrifying. And she was the only thing in the galaxy that made him feel alive. "We are here," Lyra said, stopping in front of a rusted blast door marked with a biohazard symbol. "This is not a shop," Elias said. "This is a condemn notice. It is a chop shop for illegal cybernetics," Lyra corrected, "and 7 needs a tune-up." She placed her hand on the panel. It sparked, then slid open. The interior was dark, smelling of antiseptic and old blood. It was empty, save for a robotic surgical arm hanging from the ceiling. Lyra wasted no time. She swept a pile of dirty rags off a metal table. "Get him up here," she ordered. Elias signaled 7. The wolf jumped onto the table, the metal groaning under his weight. 7 was fading. The burst of energy from the skewers had worn off, and now the creature was shivering, his eyes rolling back in his head. The neural override Lyra had used to save him was burning out his synapses. "I need to reset the governor chip," Lyra said, her hands flying as she pulled tools from a nearby tray. "If I do not stabilize the voltage, his brain will cook." She looked at Elias. Her aristocratic mask was gone. She was the scientist again, focused and intense. "I need you to hold the shunt. Here." She guided his hand to a port at the base of the wolf's skull. "It is going to get hot," she warned. "Do not let go. If the connection breaks while I am rewriting the code, he dies." "Do it," Elias said. Lyra activated a laser cutter. She made a precise incision in the wolf's neck. 7 whimpered, his legs thrashing. "Hold him," Lyra shouted over the whine of the laser. Elias pressed his weight against the wolf's shoulders, using his free hand to soothe the beast. Easy. 7. Easy. We are here. The smell of ozone filled the small room. Elias felt the heat building in the shunt under his fingers. It burned, searing his skin, but he did not flinch. He watched Lyra's face. She was inches from him, her brow furrowed in concentration, sweat beading on her upper lip. She was working with impossible speed, splicing microscopic fibers with a steady hand. Almost there, she whispered. Just one more bridge. Sparks showered down on them. 7 let out a howl that was cut short as the new code took hold. The wolf's body went rigid, then relaxed completely. The violet light in his eyes dimmed to a steady, calm pulse. Lyra dropped the laser cutter. She slumped against the table, gasping for air. "It is done," she said. "He is stable." Elias let go of the shunt. His hand was blistered, red and raw. He did not care. He looked at Lyra. She was shaking. The adrenaline dump was hitting her hard. She slid down to the floor, sitting with her back against the metal leg of the table. "Give me a minute," she murmured. "Just a minute." Elias sat down beside her. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping wolf. He looked at his burned hand, then at Lyra. Her eyes were closed, her head lolled to the side, resting on his shoulder. He froze. He was a soldier trained to move, to strike, to evade. He did not know how to be a pillow, but he did not move away. He adjusted his posture slightly, making a hollow for her head. She smelled of the cheap chemicals from the station air, but underneath that, she still smelled like herself, like snow and sterile labs and something warm and human. He sat there in the darkness, guarding her sleep with more ferocity than he had ever guarded the Empire's borders. It was a fragile peace, a stolen moment in a universe that wanted them dead. He knew that if he moved, if he spoke, the reality of their situation would come crashing back in. So he stayed still. 20 minutes later, Lyra stirred. She did not jump or startle. She simply opened her eyes and lifted her head, rubbing her neck. She looked at Elias. She saw the way he was sitting, stiff as a board, afraid to disturb her. A small smile touched her lips. "You have a terrible hero complex, Elias Thorne," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. "You think if you move a muscle, the sky will fall." "I was just resting my eyes." Elias lied. "You were guarding the perimeter of a nap," she teased. Her smile faded. She looked at his hand. "You are burned. It is nothing." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cool against his inflamed skin. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small tin of medical salve. Gently, she applied it to the burn. The pain vanished, replaced by a cool numbness. "Why did you never write?" she asked, not looking up from his hand. "After the frontier. 3 years. Elias, not one message." Elias watched her fingers working the salve into his skin. "I thought you were part of the job," he said quietly. "I thought if I contacted you, I would be admitting that the mission never really ended for me." "And now?" she asked, looking up. "Now I know the mission was the only thing that mattered." The air in the room changed. It became heavy, charged with the same electricity that had sparked from the wolf's collar. They were 2 broken people in a dirty room on an asteroid, holding hands over a jar of salve. Elias leaned in. He saw the question in her eyes. He saw the fear and the want. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her into him and forget the bounty, the Empire, and the war. But then 7 shifted on the table, a metal clamp clanking against the surface. The sound broke the spell. Elias pulled back. Lyra cleared her throat, standing up quickly and smoothing her fabricated velvet coat. "We have the fuel," she said, her voice brisk, trying to cover the tremble. "We have the scramblers. We should go." Elias stood up. He felt the loss of her touch like a cold wind. "Right, to Mnemosyne." The flight to the archive moon of Mnemosyne was tense. They spoke only of navigation vectors and fuel consumption, avoiding the silence that hung between them. Mnemosyne was a dead world. It had no atmosphere, no life, only miles of gray dust and the massive, windowless structures of the Imperial archives. It was where the Empire buried its history, literally. The archives were deep underground vaults, colder than the grave. They landed the courier ship in a blind crater 2 miles from the main entrance. The identity scramblers worked. The orbital defense grid ignored them as just another automated debris hauler. They entered the facility through an emergency exhaust vent Lyra knew about from her time in the service. The corridors were white, sterile, and silent. "We need the Vault of Treaties," Lyra whispered, checking her wrist computer. Level 9. They descended. 7 moved like a ghost, his claws retracted to avoid clicking on the pristine floors. The vault was a massive circular room lined with crystal data shards. In the center sat a single terminal. Lyra plugged the shard Elias had carried, the flight logs, into the terminal. She began cross-referencing it with the archive's biological database. The screen flashed red, file corrupted. The computer stated, data purged by order of High Command. "They wiped it," Lyra said, slamming her fist against the console. "They knew we would come here. They erased the proof that the Wolf program predates the peace talks." "Not all of it," a voice croaked from the shadows. Elias spun, weapon raised. 7 growled. An old man stepped out from behind a stack of data towers. He wore the dusty robes of a junior archivist. He looked terrified. "Who are you?" Elias demanded. "I am Silas," the man said, holding up his hands. I saw them do it. The Truth Knights. They came 3 days ago. They burned the physical backups." "Why are you still alive?" Lyra asked, stepping forward. Silas trembled. "I hid. I knew someone might come looking. The Ares faction. They are monsters. I saw the orders, the sabotage of the peace talks, the framing of Captain Thorne. It was all signed by Admiral Krennic." "You saw the signature?" Elias asked. "I did. I can testify. I can—" The old man's head snapped back. There was no sound of a gunshot, just a wet thud as Silas collapsed, a smoking hole in the center of his forehead. "Sniper!" Elias roared. He tackled Lyra, throwing her to the ground behind the terminal. 7 leaped over them, shielding them with his armored body. A shimmering distortion in the air at the far end of the vault revealed a team of Imperial Spectres, stealth commandos in active camouflage suits. They had been waiting. They decloaked, raising high-velocity rail rifles. "We are pinned!" Elias shouted, returning fire blindly over the console. Lyra was frantically typing on the terminal. "We do not have the witness," Elias yelled. "We have nothing. We have the data," Lyra screamed back. "How? It is corrupted. Not the archive," Lyra said, her eyes wild. "The backup. The illegal code I used on 7. It opened a partition in his bio-memory. The archive computer was trying to sync with him." She grabbed a cable from the terminal and jammed it into the port on 7's neck. "Download it," she commanded the wolf. 7 roared, his eyes glowing so bright they illuminated the entire vault. The data, terabytes of hidden biological records, financial trails, and military orders, streamed from the terminal directly into the wolf's organic brain. 7 was the hard drive. Done. Lyra yanked the cable free. "Run!" Elias threw a thermal detonator over the console. It exploded in a blinding flash of white phosphorus, buying them 3 seconds of confusion. They sprinted, They ran through the white corridors, rail rounds tearing chunks out of the walls around them. 7 took the lead, bowling over a specter who tried to block the exit. They burst out of the airlock into the vacuum of the moon's surface, their environment suits sealing instantly. They bounded across the gray dust toward the crater where their ship waited. "Launch!" Elias screamed into his comms as they scrambled up the ramp. He hit the cockpit, slamming the throttle forward before the ramp was even fully closed. The ship lurched into the sky. Warning: the ship's computer droned. Hull integrity compromised. 3 interceptors on pursuit vector. The stars outside the viewport were replaced by the angry red streaks of laser fire. The ship shook violently. "Shields are down to 20%, Lyra yelled from the co-pilot seat. "They are hurting us," Elias realized, looking at the tactical display. "They are pushing us toward the nebula." "No," Lyra said, pointing at the scanner. "They are pushing us toward that." Looming ahead of them was a planet of swirling white and gray clouds. It looked like a bruised eye in the darkness of space. Planet Niflheim. The computer identified. Class 4 ice world. Atmospheric storms exceeding Category 5. "They are trying to force a crash," Elias said. "They know they cannot blow us up without destroying the data in the Wolf." A heavy impact rocked the ship. The starboard engine exploded. The ship screamed, spiraling into an uncontrollable spin. "We are going down," Elias shouted, wrestling with the yoke. "Gravity is taking us." "Hold on to 7, Lyra screamed, unbuckling her straps to throw her arms around the terrified Wolf. The viewports filled with white, blinding snow. The scream of the atmosphere tearing at the hull drowned out all thought. Elias locked his eyes on the altimeter as it unwound toward 0. Brace for impact. The world turned white, then black, as they slammed into the ice. The world was white. It was a blinding, suffocating white that screamed. Elias Thorne woke to the sensation of being dragged. His body felt like a collection of shattered glass held together by a flight suit. He tried to breathe, but the air was a solid wall of ice crystals that scoured his throat. He coughed, and the sound was lost instantly in the roar of the wind. He was moving across the snow, but he was not walking. Something had him by the collar of his thermal jacket. He tilted his head back, the movement sending a spike of agony down his spine. Above him, a massive silver-black shape cut through the blizzard. Subject 7. The Wolf was trudging through hip-deep snowdrifts, his head lowered against the gale, pulling Elias with a strength that was terrifying in its persistence. Elias tried to speak, but his jaw was frozen shut. He looked to his left, a few yards away. Lyra Vane was stumbling forward, one hand gripping the Wolf's thick fur for balance. She looked like a ghost, her face pale inside the hood of her environment suit, her eyes squinting against the stinging ice. They were alive. The ship was gone, a smoking crater a mile back, swallowed by the storm. Now, there was only Niflheim. The planet was a graveyard of ambition. Through the swirling whiteout, Elias could see the skeletal remains of abandoned structures, geothermal processing towers that had been stripped and left to rot centuries ago. The wind howled through them, creating a mournful, atonal symphony. 7 stopped. The Wolf dropped Elias gently onto a patch of hard ice. The creature turned, his violet eyes glowing like beacons in the gloom. He barked, a sound that cut through the wind, and nudged Elias toward a low, metallic dome half buried in a drift. It was an old research outpost, its hull pitted and scarred by generations of storms. Lyra fell to her knees beside the airlock, her fingers clumsy with cold as she punched in a universal override code. "Come on," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the comlink. "Open, you rusted piece of junk." The hydraulics groaned, a sound like a dying beast, and the heavy door cracked open. A blast of stale, relatively warm air hit them. Seven grabbed Elias's collar again and dragged him inside. Lyra scrambled in after them and slammed the manual seal. The silence was sudden and absolute. The wind was cut off. The screaming white was replaced by the dim, red emergency lighting of the airlock. Elias tried to sit up and failed. The room spun. "Stay down," Lyra ordered. She was already stripping off her gloves, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Seven, get his jacket off. We need to check the damage." The wolf moved with surprising gentleness. He used his teeth to unzip the heavy thermal layer, peeling it back to reveal the undersuit soaked in dark blood. Elias looked down at his side. A piece of shrapnel from the cockpit console had punched through the armor mesh, lodging itself just below his ribs. "That looks expensive," Elias croaked. "Do not joke," Lyra snapped, tearing open a medical kit she had salvaged from the wreckage. "You are bleeding internally. If the spleen is ruptured, you are dead in 20 minutes. She worked with a terrifying focus. Her aristocratic persona was gone, replaced by the surgeon who had stitched monsters back together. She injected a coagulant directly into the wound, her face set in a grim mask. Seven paced the small metal room, his claws clicking on the floor. He would stop every few seconds to nudge Elias's hand or press his nose against Lyra's shoulder, whining softly. He was checking their vitals, his empathy field reading their pain and fear. "It is deep," Lyra whispered, mostly to herself. "I have to seal it." She pulled out a dermal stapler and a canister of biofoam. "This is going to hurt." "Elias, I have had worse," he lied. "No, you have not." She pressed the nozzle into the wound. Elias gritted his teeth so hard he thought they would crack. The pain was a blinding white flash, hotter than the entry of the shrapnel. He did not scream, but a guttural sound escaped his throat. Seven let out a sharp howl, feeling the pain as if it were his own. The wolf rushed over, lying down across Elias's legs, offering his body heat and a heavy, grounding weight. Lyra worked for an hour. When she was finished, her hands were covered in his blood. She slumped back against the curved wall of the dome, exhausted. "He will live," she said to the wolf. Seven rested his head on Elias's chest, his breathing slowing down to match the man's rhythm. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. He dreamed of the ice moon, of the execution platform, and of Lyra standing in the snow with a bottle of whiskey. When he woke, the red emergency lights had been replaced by a soft, pulsating blue glow. He turned his head. The dome had a viewing port made of reinforced plexiglass. Outside, the storm had broken, revealing a sky set on fire. The aurora of Niflheim was not like the gentle lights of Earth. It was violent, bands of neon purple, bruised magenta, and toxic green thrashing across the stars. It looked like the universe was bruising itself. Lyra was sitting by a small heating unit she had managed to activate. She was staring at the lights, her profile sharp and lonely against the alien sky. "You are staring again," Elias rasped. Lyra turned, her face softened, the hard lines of stress smoothing out. "You are awake." She crawled over to him, checking the biofoam seal on his side. Her touch was clinical, professional, but her fingers lingered on his skin a second longer than necessary. "How is the patient?" she asked. "Alive, thanks to you." She sat back on her heels, wrapping her arms around herself. The dome was cold, the heater struggling against the ambient temperature of 40 degrees below zero. "We are stuck here." "Elias," she said quietly. "The ship is gone, the comms are fried, and we have half a crate of emergency rations." Elias tried to sit up, wincing as his side pulled. Seven immediately moved to support his back, acting as a living cushion. "What kind of rations?" Elias asked. Lyra made a face. "Nutrient paste. Flavor, unflavored, and something that claims to be dried peach but smells like wet cardboard." Elias managed a dry chuckle. "I prefer the cardboard. It has more texture." Lyra laughed. It was a small, fragile sound, but it pushed back the darkness of the dome. "You are impossible. We are stranded on a frozen hellscape with the entire Imperial fleet hunting us, and you are critiquing the menu. Perspective. Lyra. At least we are not being broadcast on live television anymore." She looked at him, her eyes dark in the blue light of the aurora. "No. Now we are just ghosts." She reached into the crate and tossed him a foil packet. "Eat. You lost a pint of blood. If you pass out again, I am letting 7 eat you." "I think he prefers the skewers," Elias said, tearing open the packet. They ate in silence, the only sound the hum of the heater and the wind picking up again outside. The shared hardship stripped away the pretenses they had held on to. There was no room for the soldier or the aristocrat here. There was only the man and the woman, shivering in the dark. Lyra finished her paste and moved closer to the heater. She was shivering, violent tremors that shook her small frame. Elias watched her. He saw the exhaustion in the slope of her shoulders. "Come here," he said. Lyra looked at him. "I am fine. Elias, you are freezing, and the heater is dying. Body heat is simple physics. Lyra, do not overthink it." She hesitated, then crawled over to him. She lay down beside him on the hard floor, careful of his injury. 7 shifted, draping his massive tail over both of their legs like a weighted blanket. Elias wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her against him. She was stiff at first, holding herself apart, but the cold was relentless. Slowly, she melted. She buried her face in the curve of his neck, her cold nose pressing against his skin. They lay there for a long time, the heat of their bodies creating a small island of warmth in the freezing sea of the dome. "I hate the cold," Lyra whispered into his neck. "I know," Elias said. "I grew up on a tropical world. Did you know that? Prime Secundus. It was always summer. The ocean was so warm it felt like a bath. I grew up in the ventilation shafts of a mining colony," Elias said. "I did not see the sun until I was 18. Lyra pulled back slightly to look at him. Her eyes searched his face, tracing the scars, the lines of fatigue. "That is why you joined the service. To see the sky. No. I joined because I was hungry, and because they promised me that if I fought for the Empire, I would matter. And did you? Matter?" Elias looked at the aurora swirling above them. "I was a very effective weapon. Weapons matter to the people holding them. But to the people being aimed at, I was just a catastrophe." Lyra rested her hand on his chest, over his heart. "You are not a weapon. Elias, you are the man who stopped to save a wolf. You are the man who let himself be executed to save 40 orphans." She moved her hand up to his jaw, her thumb brushing his cheek. "You are the only good thing I have found in this galaxy." Elias's breath caught. The air in the dome suddenly felt very thin. "Lyra," he warned softly. She did not stop. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "I am tired of being afraid. Elias, I am tired of running and hiding and pretending that I do not feel this." "Feel what?" "This." She closed the gap. Her lips were cold, chapped from the wind. But her mouth was fire. It was not a tentative kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of fear and adrenaline and 3 years of unspoken longing. Elias froze for a heartbeat, his mind warring with his training. This was a distraction. This was dangerous. Then he surrendered. He tangled his hand in her hair, pulling her closer. He kissed her back with a hunger that frightened him. It was a rebellion against the cold, against the empire, against the probability of their death. In that kiss, they were claiming something for themselves, something the adjudicator could not sentence and the truth knights could not kill. He felt her heart hammering against his chest, matching the rhythm of his own. The desire was a physical ache, a sharp, sweet pain that made him forget the shrapnel in his side. Lyra made a soft sound in her throat and pressed closer, her leg hooking over his. Seven lifted his head. He let out a low, rumbling growl, not of aggression but of warning. Elias broke the kiss. He rested his forehead against Lyra's, both of them gasping for air. "We stop," Elias whispered, his voice rough. Lyra kept her eyes closed, her hand gripping his shirt. "Why?" "Because if we start this, I will not be able to focus on keeping you alive, and I intend to keep you alive." Lyra opened her eyes. They were wet, shining with unshed tears. "You are a stubborn idiot. I know." She buried her face in his neck again. She did not move away. If anything, she held him tighter. Elias stroked her hair, staring up at the alien lights. He felt more connected to her in that moment of restraint than he would have in any act of passion. They had crossed a line. They were no longer partners. They were something else, something that had everything to lose. "I lied to you," Lyra said suddenly, her voice muffled against his skin. "About the peaches? About who I am?" Elias went still. "Tell me." "My name is Vane. But I am not just from a wealthy family, my uncle is Valerius Vane." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Valerius Vane was the High Counselor of the Interior. He was the architect of the loyalty laws. He was the man who signed the death warrants for entire planets. "The counselor is your uncle?" Elias asked. Lyra nodded against him. "He raised me after my parents died. He wanted me to be like him, cold, efficient. He put me in the science division because he thought I could build better weapons for his wars. And instead you stole his wolf," Elias said. "I found out what the wolf program really was. It was not for defense. It was for domestic control. They wanted to put a pack of these things in every city to hunt down dissidents. When I confronted him, he told me that morality was a luxury for the weak. He disowned me. He erased my clearance." She looked up at him. "That is why the bounty is so high. It is not just about the data. Elias, it is personal. I am a loose end, a stain on the Vane family honor. He will not stop until I am dead." Elias tightened his arm around her. "Then he is going to be disappointed." He looked at the wolf. Seven was watching them, his head cocked to the side. "We are going to finish this. Lyra, we are going to take that data to the core systems, and we are going to burn your uncle's legacy to the ground." "How?" Lyra asked. "We have no ship. We are stuck in a dome on an ice ball." Elias pointed to a console on the far wall of the dome. It was dark, covered in frost. This was a research outpost. They had to send their data somewhere. If there is a transmitter, we can use it. The storm broke 2 hours later. Elias, moving stiffly but fueled by the nutrient paste and determination, pried the panel off the communications console. "It is dead," he said. "The power couplings are corroded." Lyra was scanning the schematics of the facility on her wrist computer. "There is a relay station," she said, 3 miles north. It is a deep space broadcast hub. It sits on a geothermal fault line. If the core is still active, and it could have enough power to punch a signal through the interference. 3 miles on foot, Elias said. In this weather, Seven barked, standing by the airlock. He thinks we can make it, Lyra said. They geared up. Elias checked his blaster, 2 charge packs left. He checked the field cutter. It was at 50%. They stepped out into the night. The wind had died down to a manageable howl. The snow was packed hard and slick as glass. They moved in a tight formation, 7 leading, breaking the trail. The walk was brutal. Every step sent a jolt of pain through Elias's side. He leaned heavily on Lyra, who supported him without complaint. They reached the relay station as the twin moons of Niflheim were rising. It was a massive structure, a spire of black metal jutting out of the ice like a spear. At its base was a cavernous entrance leading underground. They descended into the dark. The air here was warmer, smelling of sulfur and ozone. They reached the central control room. In the center of the chamber was the core, a pulsating sphere of ancient alien technology that the Empire had built the station around. It hummed with a low, throbbing frequency. Lyra rushed to the control interface. "It is dormant," she said, her fingers flying over the dusty keys. "I need to jump-start the ignition cycle." She began rerouting power. Elias stood guard at the entrance, his weapon raised. He had a bad feeling. The silence was too deep. Suddenly, the core flared to life. A wave of blue energy rippled out from the sphere. It was not radiation, it was something else. Seven, who had been pacing nervously, suddenly stopped. He threw his head back and let out a sound that was not a howl, but a harmonious tone that matched the hum of the core. "What is he doing?" Elias asked. Lyra looked at the readings. Her eyes went wide. "The core. It uses bioneural frequencies. It is reacting to 7. The blue wave expanded, passing through the walls of the station, outside, in the darkness of the ice ridges. The local wildlife, predatory snowstalkers with 6 legs and razor claws, had been gathering, scenting blood. But as the wave hit them, they stopped. They did not attack. They lay down in the snow, chittering softly, soothed by an overwhelming projection of calm. "He is amplifying his empathy field," Lyra whispered. "He is broadcasting peace." It was beautiful. It was a miracle. And it was a beacon. Elias saw the motion tracker on his wrist ping. "Contact," he shouted. "Multiple signals. Fast movers." The roar of engines echoed down the tunnel. Imperial hunters. They burst into the chamber, 3 skimmers piloted by armored trackers. These were not standard troops. They wore the gray cloaks of the Vanehouse Guard. "Take them alive!" the lead hunter shouted, his voice amplified. "The counselor wants the girl." Elias opened fire. His first shot took the lead skimmer in the intake turbine. It spun out, crashing into the wall in a shower of sparks. 7 roared. The calm was gone, replaced by a terrifying protective fury. The wolf leaped, clearing 20 feet in a single bound, knocking a hunter off his bike. "Lyra, get the broadcast!" Elias yelled, ducking behind a pillar as laser fire chewed up the stone. "I need time." Elias popped up, firing 2 controlled bursts. Another hunter went down, but more were coming. He could hear the heavy thrum of a troop transport landing on the surface above. "We are out of time," Elias shouted. He looked at the core. It was glowing brighter, destabilized by the fighting. 7, Elias called out. The wolf disengaged from the hunter, leaving the man terrified but alive. He bounded back to Elias. "Lyra, the tunnels!" Elias pointed to a maintenance shaft behind the core. They scrambled into the narrow passage just as the chamber filled with gray-cloaked soldiers. They ran. The tunnels were a maze of steaming pipes and slick metal. They could hear the hunters pursuing, their boots heavy on the grating. "We are trapped," Lyra gasped, clutching her side. "This tunnel loops back to the hangars." "Exactly," Elias said. They burst out of the tunnel onto a landing ledge. Below them, on the main landing deck, sat the Imperial frigate that had dropped the hunters. It was a Valkyrie-class interceptor, heavily armed, fast, and currently unguarded because the entire squad was chasing them in the tunnels. Elias smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. 7, can you make that jump? The wolf looked at the ship, 30 feet below. He looked at Elias. He growled a yes. Lyra looked terrified. We are jumping? Elias grabbed her hand. We are flying. They leaped. For a second, they were weightless. Then they slammed onto the hull of the frigate. Elias rolled, absorbing the impact, pulling Lyra with him. 7 landed with a heavy metallic clang. They scrambled for the top hatch. Elias blew the lock with his last charge pack. They dropped into the cockpit. Elias slid into the pilot's seat. It was a military craft, far more complex than the courier ship, but Elias knew it. He had flown these in the war. The hunters burst onto the ledge above, firing down at the ship. Too late, Elias muttered. He engaged the thrusters. The frigate roared to life, the afterburners incinerating the hunters on the ledge. The ship shot up the shaft, smashing through the ice doors at the surface and rocketing into the storm. Elias pulled back on the yoke, punching through the atmosphere in seconds. The sensors lit up. 2 cruisers were in orbit, blocking the vector. Hold on, Elias said. He did not try to outrun them. He turned the ship directly toward them, accelerating to attack speed. What are you doing? Lyra screamed. Playing chicken, Elias said. He armed the photon torpedoes but did not fire. He flew straight down the throat of the blockade. At the last possible second, the cruisers blinked. They broke formation to avoid the collision. Elias punched the hyperdrive. The stars streaked into lines of light. Silence returned to the cockpit. Lyra unbuckled and leaned over the console, breathing hard. 7 was pacing in the back, adrenaline still coursing through him. Elias checked the nav computer. We are clear. He looked at Lyra. Her face was smudged with grease and blood, her hair a disaster. She looked beautiful. Where are we going? She asked. Elias set the coordinates. The inner systems. The capital. He looked at her, his eyes hard. You said your uncle wants a war. Let us go give him one. The capital city of Ethelgard was not sleeping. It was preening. The entire planet had been turned into a stage for the Unity Summit, the annual extravaganza where the Empire patted itself on the back for another year of crushing dissent and expanding borders. The skyline was ablaze with gold and crimson holographic banners, and the air traffic lanes were choked with the luxury yachts of planetary governors, arms dealers, and the sycophants who fed on the scraps of power. Elias Thorne piloted the stolen Valkyrie frigate into the heavy commercial descent lane. The ship had been hastily modified. The military transponder was masked, broadcasting a fake ID that identified them as a catering transport for the High Council's banquet. We are entering the net, Elias said, his hands steady on the yoke. Beside him, Lyra Vane was applying a layer of synthetic skin to her fingertips to fool the bioscanners. She looked terrifyingly composed. She wore a stolen dress uniform of a fleet admiral's aide, stiff and severe. Are the upload packets ready? Elias asked. Lyra nodded, not looking up. The data is sequestered, but we are not just dumping the files. Elias, we agreed. Elias sighed. He looked back at Subject 7. The massive wolf was standing in the center of the cargo hold, draped in a shimmering semi-translucent fabric. It was a military-grade hollow cloak, projecting the image of a floating anti-grav luggage pallet stacked with crates of vintage wine. We agreed to a plan that has a 90% chance of getting us killed, Elias said. A surgical reveal is safer. We upload the evidence of the false flag operation. We show the wolf is sentient, and we leave. We let the public connect the dots. The public does not connect dots. Elias, Lyra said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were hard. They watch the show. If we just dump data, the Ministry of Information will spin it. They will call it a deep fake. They will say it is terrorist propaganda. We have to give them something they cannot spin. We have to give them a moment of undeniable truth. And that requires us to be in the room, Elias countered. It requires us to look them in the eye. Lyra corrected. The comms panel buzzed. Unidentified transport. This is Unity Control. Transmit clearance codes. Elias keyed the mic. Unity Control. This is Transport Alpha 9 carrying vintage reserves for Minister Varkas. We are running late due to ion storms in the outer rim. There was a pause, a long, static-filled silence. Alpha 9, you are cleared for Docking Bay 4, but be advised, security protocols are at level crimson. Any deviation from your flight path will result in immediate vaporization. Understood, Elias said. He cut the channel. We are in. Docking Bay 4 was a cavern of polished marble and gold leaf. It did not look like a hangar. It looked like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of combustion. They descended the ramp. Elias wore the gray livery of a service droid handler, his face obscured by a rebreather mask. He pushed the anti-grav pallet that was secretly a 300-pound apex predator. Lyra walked ahead, clutching a datapad, projecting an aura of harried bureaucratic authority. The security checkpoint was a farce of pageantry over practicality. A line of Imperial guards stood in ceremonial armor that was too heavy for combat but perfect for parades. They were stopping every entrant, but not to check for weapons. One guard, a man with a mustache waxed to needle points. Stopped Lyra. Halt, he barked. He held up a measuring tape. Your sash, Lieutenant. Lyra stopped, blinking. My sash? It appears to be 2 millimeters out of regulation width for a level 4 aide, the guard said, sniffing disdainfully. The Emperor demands perfection. Lyra stared at him. She was carrying enough encrypted data to topple the government, and behind her was a genetically engineered wolf capable of tearing a tank apart, disguised as wine. And this man was worried about her sash. My apologies. Sergeant, Lyra said, her voice dripping with false contrition. I had to make emergency repairs to my uniform after a toast mishap with the minister. The guard narrowed his eyes, then waved her through with a sigh of immense burden. Fix it before the broadcast. We cannot have sloppy hems on the global feed. They walked past the metal detectors. The scanner swept over the floating pallet. Wait, the guard said. Elias froze. His hand drifted toward the concealed blaster in his waistband. The guard peered at the scanner screen. That creates of wine. It is reading a high thermal output. Elias improvised. It is the Hyperion vintage, sir. It has to be kept at body temperature or the fermentation destabilizes. Very volatile. If I open it, it might explode. The guard's eyes went wide. He knew better than to ruin the minister's wine. Move along, he shouted, waving them away frantically, so quickly. They hurried into the lift. As the doors closed, Seven let out a low, muffled growl from beneath the hollow cloak. Everyone is a critic, Elias muttered. The lift deposited them in the backstage labyrinth of the Unity Arena. The air here vibrated with the sound of 1,000 servers humming in the walls. They were close to the nerve center of the Empire. The plan was simple in its insanity. The Unity Summit was being broadcast from the Grand Observation Deck, a suspended platform overlooking the gathered masses. To get there, they had to pass through the server sanctum, the cooling chamber for the massive broadcast arrays. They moved through the corridors, avoiding the patrols of elite truth knights. Lyra led them to a heavy blast door marked Authorized Technicians Only. She used a slicer spike to override the lock. They slipped inside. The server sanctum was a forest of black monoliths, towering banks of processors bathed in freezing blue light. The noise was a deafening drone of cooling fans. Lyra moved to the main interface console. She stripped off her gloves, her fingers flying over the keys. "I am tapping into the primary feed," she said. "When the summit begins, I can hijack the signal. But I need to manually bridge the connection to the wolf's bio-memory." She pointed to a port on the wall. 7. Here. Elias deactivated the hollow cloak. The shimmering image of the wine crates vanished, revealing the massive silver-black wolf. 7 shook himself, his fur bristling in the cold air. Elias stood watch at the door, watching the corridor through a crack in the frame. He could see the VIPs arriving down the hall. He saw Minister Varkas, the charismatic architect of the Peace Through Power initiative, laughing with a group of arms manufacturers, and walking beside him, looking grim and skeletal in his black robes, was Counselor Valerius Vane, Lyra's uncle. Elias turned back to Lyra. She was staring at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. "He is out there, isn't he?" she asked without turning around. "Yes," Elias said. Lyra paused. She rested her forehead against the cool metal of the server bank. "I used to sit on his lap while he signed execution orders," she whispered. "I thought he was signing trade agreements. He gave me sweets and told me I was the future of the Empire." "He was wrong," Elias said, walking over to her. "You are the end of it." Lyra turned to face him. The blue light of the servers cast sharp shadows on her face, making her look fragile and fierce all at once. "Elias," she said, her voice shaking. "I am terrified." "Good," Elias said. "Fear keeps you sharp." "No," she said, stepping closer. "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of being the reason you die." She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his gray technician's suit. "This is reckless. Elias, I am dragging you into a fire because I have a vendetta. You should go. You can set the timer and leave." Elias looked down at her. He took her hands in his. His palms were rough, scarred from a lifetime of holding weapons. Hers were smooth, the hands of a creator. "I am a soldier. Lyra. I have spent my whole life following orders. Go here. Kill this. Capture that. I never asked why. I never asked if it was right." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the drone of the fans. "Loving you is the only thing that ever made me brave without orders. I am not here for the politics. I am not here for the revolution. I am here because you are here." Lyra let out a soft sound, a sob trapped in her throat. She pulled him down to her, kissing him hard. It was not the desperate, freezing kiss of the ice planet. This was a kiss of confirmation. It was a promise made in the dark, minutes before the end of the world, when they broke apart. Elias rested his forehead against hers. "We finish this," he said. "Together, together." She echoed. The console beeped. "The broadcast is starting," Lyra said, the steel returning to her voice. "We are live in 2 minutes." The grand observation deck was a masterpiece of intimidation. It hung suspended over the arena, a circular platform of glass and steel. The Emperor was absent. He was a reclusive figure, a hologram that rarely appeared. So the stage belonged to the conspirators. Minister Varkas stood at the podium, his voice booming out to the billions watching across the systems. "Citizens, we stand today on the precipice of a new era. The threats to our glorious peace have been many. Traitors, saboteurs, beasts of the outer rim. The crowd roared, a sound like an ocean crashing. In the VIP box, Valerius Vane sat sipping a glass of water, his eyes scanning the crowd with bored detachment. He whispered something to Admiral Krennic, who chuckled. "But we have triumphed," Varkas shouted, raising his fist. "We have crushed the rebellion. We have secured the borders." Elias and Lyra stepped onto the rear of the platform. They were in the shadows, behind the wall of Truth Knights guarding the stage. "Now," Lyra whispered into her comms. In the server room, the timer hit 0. The massive holographic screens behind Minister Varkas flickered. The image of the Imperial flag dissolved into static. The crowd gasped. Varkas turned around, confused. "Technical difficulties," he shouted, "to cut the feed." But the feed did not cut. Instead, a new image appeared. It was grainy footage, taken from a security camera on the Frontier station. It showed Admiral Krennic, the man currently sitting in the VIP box, handing a briefcase of credits to a known mercenary leader. The audio crackled over the speakers. "Make it look like the rebels did it." Krennic's voice boomed. "I want civilian casualties, enough to justify the annexation." The arena went deadly silent. Varkas froze. Krennic stood up, knocking over his chair. "What is this?" Krennic screamed. "Turn it off!" Lyra stepped out of the shadows. She walked onto the main stage, the bright lights catching her severe uniform. She looked small against the backdrop of the giant screens, but she commanded the space. "It is the truth." "Admiral," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone she had hacked into. The Truth Knights turned, weapons raised. "Secure her!" Vane shouted, standing up. "It is the traitor! Kill her!" 2 knights rushed Lyra. Elias moved. He did not use his blaster. He stepped in front of Lyra, intercepting the first knight with a combat baton he had pulled from his belt. He blocked a strike that would have taken Lyra's head off, then swept the knight's legs, but there were too many of them. 6 more knights poured onto the stage. "7!" Lyra screamed. The wolf exploded from the service hatch. He did not look like a beast. He looked like a judgment. He hit the center of the stage, a blur of silver and black. A knight fired a shock lance. 7 dodged it with supernatural speed, closing the distance. The crowd screamed, expecting blood. But 7 did not kill. He grabbed the knight's weapon arm in his jaws and applied precisely enough pressure to crush the armor plating and force the man to drop the lance. He shoved the knight backward into his squad mates. He moved like a dancer, weaving through the laser fire. He tackled another knight, pinning him to the ground, but instead of ripping out his throat, 7 simply roared in his face, a sound so primal it made the man faint from terror. "He is not killing them," someone in the crowd shouted. "Look, on the giant screens." The footage changed. It was no longer the Admiral. It was a stream of biological data. It was a memory. The audience saw the world through 7's eyes. They saw the lab where he was made. They saw the pain of the experiments. They saw Lyra's hand reaching out to him. They saw the loyalty, the fear, and the love. They heard Lyra's voice narrating the data. "They told you these were monsters," Lyra said, standing amidst the chaos of the fight. "They told you they needed to be controlled. But he is not the monster. They are." She pointed at the VIP box. Valerius Vane looked down at his niece. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Kill them all," Vane ordered. "Fire into the crowd if you have to." The Truth Knights hesitated. The public was watching. The wolf was not attacking. He was defending. Elias was back to back with 7, fighting off 3 guards with nothing but the baton in his fists. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he was smiling. "Lyra!" Elias shouted, "and the final packet." Lyra tapped the command on her datapad. The screen shifted one last time. It showed the treaty logs, the documents proving that the peace had been real, and the war had been manufactured for profit. The truth hung over the city, 50 feet high. "It is over, Uncle," Lyra shouted, looking up at the box. Vane drew a pistol from his robes. He aimed not at Lyra, but at the wolf. "If the beast dies, the signal dies," Vane screamed. He fired. Elias saw the weapon level. He saw the flash. "No!" Elias threw himself in front of Seven. The bolt hit Elias in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard to the deck. "Elias!" Lyra screamed. Seven let out a sound that shattered the windows of the observation deck. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and rage. The wolf turned toward the VIP box. He crouched, muscles coiling to spring. He could clear the distance. He could tear Vane apart. "Seven, no!" Lyra yelled, rushing to Elias's side. "Do not kill him! If you kill him, you prove them right." The wolf froze. He looked at Vane, who was preparing to fire again. He looked at Lyra, who was pressing her hands over Elias's wound. The wolf made a choice. He turned his back on the man who wanted to kill him. He walked over to Elias and knelt. He curled his massive body around the fallen soldier and the weeping woman, creating a living shield against the world. He looked up at the camera drones. His eyes were clear. He was not a weapon. He was a witness. The image was beamed to 12 star systems. A wolf, protecting a human, refusing to kill. Vane fired again, but the shot deflected off the wolf's armored shoulder plating. Then, the feed cut. The screens went black. "Regain control." Vane screamed into his comms, "Shut down the grid." But it was too late. In the streets below, the silence broke. It started as a murmur, then a shout, then a roar. The people had seen the truth. They had seen the monsters in the high tower and the humanity in the beast. A barrier crashed. A riot squad threw down their shields. In the server sanctum, a group of young technicians saw the kill order come through for the observation deck. They looked at each other. They looked at the blocked feed. One of them, a girl with blue hair, typed a command. "Rerouting," she said, boosting the signal through the emergency channels. The screens flickered back to life. "You cannot stop the signal," a voice hacked over the speakers. The city erupted. On the stage, the Truth Knights lowered their weapons. They looked at Vane, then at the wolf. They backed away. Lyra looked up. Elias was conscious, grimacing in pain. "Did we win?" he whispered. Lyra looked at the riots starting in the plaza. She looked at her uncle fleeing the VIP box as his own guards turned on him. She kissed Elias's forehead. "We started a fire. Elias, now we just have to survive the burn." The wolf threw his head back and howled, a song of victory that was picked up by every speaker in the city. The anthem of the new revolution. The capital of Ethelgard had ceased to be a city and had become a wound. In the 48 hours since the broadcast at the Unity Summit, the metropolis had fractured down the middle, a jagged line drawn not by geography but by belief. On the high walkways of the upper districts, loyalist militias clad in the Emperor's gold patrolled with nervous fingers on triggers, calling for the heads of the traitors. Down in the industrial sectors and the transit veins, the resistance was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. They wore gray armbands, the color of the wolf, and painted the symbol of a paw print over the imperial crests. Elias Thorne watched the city burn from the window of a diplomatic safehouse. It was the extraterritorial residence of the Pleiades trade delegation, a neutral power that had granted them temporary asylum while the galaxy held its breath. His shoulder throbbed where the laser bolt had burned him, a dull, rhythmic ache that reminded him he was alive. He turned away from the glass. The room was quiet, filled with the hum of air scrubbers and the soft clicking of Lyra Vane's nails on a datapad. She sat at a glass table, surrounded by legal scrolls and holographic precedents. Subject 7 lay on a rug beside her, his massive head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking Elias's movements with a calm, amber intensity. "We cannot stay here," Elias said, breaking the silence. "The trade delegation is nervous. They will not hold the door if the Imperial Guard brings a siege ram." Lyra did not look up. "We are not staying. Elias, we are leaving tomorrow." Elias walked over to the table. He looked at the maps of the smuggling routes she had open on a side screen. "I can get us a transport," he said. "There is a blockade runner in the southern hangar. If we leave at dawn, we can punch through the orbital net before they scramble the interceptors. We can be in the outer rim in 3 days. We can disappear." Lyra stopped typing. She looked up at him. Her face was pale. The strain of the last few days etched around her eyes, but her gaze was steady. "Disappear," she repeated. "And become what? A rumor? A bedtime story about the wolf and the witch who almost broke the empire?" Elias leaned his hands on the table, leaning in close. "We become alive. Lyra, that is the priority, is it?" she asked. She stood up and walked to the window, standing where he had stood. She looked out at the smoke rising from the government plaza. "If we run now, Elias, the truth runs with us. The Admiralty will spin the narrative. They will say the broadcast was a deep fake. They will say we were terrorists who brainwashed a dangerous animal. In a year, no one will remember the files. They will only remember that we ran away." Elias watched her back. He knew that posture. It was the same stance she had held on the execution platform. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though he already knew. Lyra turned around. "We do not run. We demand a tribunal." Elias laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "A tribunal? In an imperial court? That is not a trial." "Lyra, that is a scheduled execution with a dress code, not an imperial court," she corrected. "An interstellar tribunal." She tapped the datapad, bringing up a dense document, the Eridani Concordat. It is an ancient treaty the Empire signed 200 years ago to gain access to the hyperlanes. It grants any citizen accused of high treason the right to a trial observed by neutral systems if the crime involves off-world biological assets. She pointed to the wolf. 7 is the asset. He is also the evidence. If we invoke the Concordat, they cannot try us in secret. They have to open the doors to the ambassadors of the Pleiades, the Centauri, and the free systems. If they refuse, they lose their trade routes. The economy collapses in a week. "It is a trap," Elias said, shaking his head. "They will rig it. They will find a loophole. They will try," Lyra admitted, "but it gives us a stage where they cannot cut the feed." Elias looked at 7. The wolf let out a soft chuff, his tail thumping once against the floor. "He wants to do it," Lyra said softly. "He is tired of hiding." "Elias, aren't you?" Elias looked at the woman he loved. He saw the fire in her, the refusal to let the darkness win. He realized then that he had spent his life surviving, but she was teaching him how to live. He reached out and took her hand. "If we do this, there is no extraction plan, no back door. We walk into the heart of the beast, and we either kill it or it eats us." "I know," Lyra whispered. Elias squeezed her hand. "Then call the ambassadors. Let us go to court. The Hall of Justice was designed to make a man feel small." The ceiling vaulted 300 feet overhead, supported by pillars of black obsidian that seemed to drink the light. Today, the vast chamber was packed to capacity. On the left sat the imperial loyalists, generals, admirals, and high-born aristocrats, a sea of stiff uniforms and cold sneers. On the right sat the delegations from the neutral systems, a colorful, chaotic mix of alien species and human diplomats, watching with wide, calculating eyes. In the center, in a hovering gravity box reserved for the accused, stood Elias, Lyra, and Seven. They wore no chains. That had been Lyra's first condition. The High Inquisitor, a man named Moros who looked like he had been carved from gray stone, stood at the prosecutor's podium. He did not look at the prisoners. He looked at the cameras that were beaming the trial to 500 worlds. The accused stand before you. Moros boomed, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the hall. Elias Thorne, a traitor who sold state secrets. Lyra Vane, a scientist who perverted nature. And the beast. He pointed a long, bony finger at Seven, a biological error, a mindless killing machine that they have unleashed upon our city. The crowd on the left murmured in agreement. Lyra stepped forward. She wore a simple white tunic, stark against the black stone. She looked regal. "Objection," she said, her voice clear. "The wolf has a name. It is Subject 7, and he is not a machine. He is a client of this court." Laughter rippled through the loyalist benches. "A client?" Moros sneered. "It is a dog, woman. It does not have rights. It has a serial number. It has a memory," Lyra countered. "And under the Concordat, a sentient being capable of memory is capable of testimony." Moros slammed his hand on the podium, and "This is a mockery. The prosecution moves to have the beast euthanized immediately for public safety." The Chief Justice, a Centauri elder with skin like wrinkled parchment, leaned forward from the high bench. "The tribunal acknowledges the presence of the creature. If the defense can demonstrate sentience, the creature stays. If not, the order stands." Lyra looked at Seven. She did not give a command. She did not use a hand signal. She simply nodded. Seven stood up. He walked to the edge of the gravity box. The energy field shimmered in front of him. He looked at Moros. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Seven raised a paw and placed it on the interface panel of the box. He tapped a sequence of lights. Blue, green, blue. The energy field lowered. The crowd gasped. Guards raised their weapons. Seven did not attack. He walked out of the box and approached the bench of the Chief Justice. He sat down, lowered his head in a bow of respect, and then pushed a small data slate across the floor toward the justice with his nose. The justice picked it up. He looked at the slate, then at the wolf. "He has solved the logic puzzle required for entry into the legal guild," the justice said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Seven barked once. The prosecution's argument that this is a mindless beast is rejected. The justice ruled, slamming his gavel, "The trial proceeds." The hours that followed were a brutal dismantling of privacy. Moros, realizing he could not attack the wolf's nature, attacked the couple's morality. He brought up holograms of their escape, the stolen ship, the destroyed lab, the intimate moments captured on surveillance feeds in the safe house. "Look at them," Moros shouted, pointing to a grainy image of Elias holding Lyra on the ice planet. "This is not a political revolution. This is a sordid affair. The soldier was seduced by the scientist. She used her feminine wiles to twist his mind, to turn a hero of the empire into her lapdog." He turned to Elias. "Admit it. Thorne, you are not a liberator. You are a lovesick puppet. You betrayed your oath because you wanted her bed." The hall went silent. All eyes turned to Elias. Elias stood slowly. He smoothed the front of his gray tunic. He looked at Moros, then he looked at Lyra. He saw the shame trying to creep into her eyes, the fear that their love was being turned into something dirty. He reached out and took her hand in front of the entire galaxy. He turned to the cameras. The Inquisitor is half right, Elias said, his voice steady. I did break my oath. I broke an oath to a regime that murders children to balance a budget. I broke an oath to a flag that stands for fear. He squeezed Lyra's hand. But he is wrong about why. I did not do it because I was seduced. I did it because for the first time in my life, I found something worth protecting. He looked at the loyalist benches. You call it treason. I call it waking up. If loving a woman who speaks the truth and a wolf who has more honor than your entire admiralty makes me a criminal, then I am guilty, and I am not ashamed. Lyra looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. She lifted her chin. We are not ashamed, she echoed. The impact of the moment was seismic. In the silence of the courtroom, the propaganda crumbled. They were not monsters. They were people. Morrow stood open-mouthed, his narrative shattered. Admiral Vost, a man with a scarred face and eyes like flint, stood up in the front row of the loyalist section. He checked his wrist chrono. Enough of this theater, Vost barked. He drew a heavy shock pistol from his belt. The law has failed, he shouted. The military assumes command. It was the signal. The doors of the hall blew inward. 24 stormtroopers in black armor stormed the chamber, firing into the ceiling. This is a coup! The Chief Justice screamed before ducking behind his bench. Vost aimed his weapon at the gravity box. Kill the wolf, Vost ordered. Kill the traitors. The courtroom descended into bedlam. Civilians screamed and scrambled over seats. The neutral ambassadors dove for cover. Elias shoved Lyra behind the podium of the box. Stay down, he yelled, grabbing a datapad to use as a shield. But the stormtroopers were not looking at Elias. They were training their rifles on Seven. The wolf did not run. He did not hide. He became a storm. Seven leaped from the center of the room, clearing the prosecution table in a single bound. He hit the first wave of stormtroopers like a cannonball. But even in the chaos, his precision was surgical. He did not bite to kill. He clamped his jaws on gun barrels, wrenching them from hands. He slammed his armored shoulders into chests, knocking wind out of lungs but leaving ribs intact. Vost fired at Lyra. Elias saw the bolt coming. He moved to intercept it, but he was too slow. Seven was not. The wolf twisted in midair, taking the laser blast on his flank. The armor plating absorbed the heat, glowing cherry red. Seven landed between Vost and Lyra, snarling. Vost fumbled to recharge his weapon. You abomination! Vost screamed. Seven lunged. He pinned Vost to the floor, his massive paws on the Admiral's shoulders. Vost squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the teeth to tear out his throat. Nothing happened. Vost opened his eyes. Seven was staring down at him, jaws closed, eyes calm. The wolf looked at the terrified Admiral, then looked up at the cameras that were still rolling. He stepped back. He let the man live. The stormtroopers, seeing their commander pinned and spared, hesitated. Stand down! Elias roared, picking up a fallen rifle and holding it high. Look at him! He has more restraint than you do. Are you soldiers or are you butchers? The question hung in the smoke-filled air. One stormtrooper lowered his rifle, then another. The coup had lasted 3 minutes. It had failed not because of firepower, but because of a moral impossibility. The beast had refused to be a beast. Imperial guards from the outer corridor finally pushed through, securing the room. But they arrested Vost, not Elias. The room was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the wolf and the whimpering of the disgraced Admiral. The Chief Justice slowly rose from behind his bench. He adjusted his robes, his hands shaking. He looked at the wreckage of his courtroom, then at the trio standing in the center of it all. He picked up his gavel. The attempt to subvert this tribunal by force is noted, the justice said, his voice icy. And it is rejected. He looked at Moros, who was cowering under a table. The prosecution has no case. The actions of the admiral prove the defense's claim. The rot is in the state, not the accused. He slammed the gavel down. Case dismissed. The charges are annulled. The High Council is hereby indicted for conspiracy against the Concordat. A roar went up from the right side of the hall, joined by the cheers of the crowds outside. It was a sound of release, a sound of a dam breaking. Lyra buried her face in Elias's chest. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. They stood there, an island of calm in the center of the revolution. Seven walked over to them. He licked Lyra's hand, then nudged Elias's leg. Elias looked down at the wolf. "You show off," Elias whispered. Seven wagged his tail. The weeks that followed were a blur of treaties, resignations, and the rewriting of a constitution that had stood for 1,000 years. The empire did not vanish overnight, but the fear that fueled it had evaporated. Loyalty was no longer something programmed in a lab. It was something that had to be earned. But Elias and Lyra did not stay for the politics. They were not builders of governments. They were the spark, not the engine. On a clear morning, 3 weeks after the trial, they stood on the landing pad of the capital's spaceport. A new ship waited for them. It was not a stolen freighter or a military frigate. It was an exploration vessel, gifted by the Centauri delegation. It was named the Pathfinder. Lyra stood by the ramp, watching the sunrise over the city. The drones were gone. The sky was blue. "You know," she said, adjusting the strap of her pack. "They want you to run for senator," Elias groaned, hoisting a crate of supplies. "I would rather wrestle Seven for a steak." "Speaking of," Lyra said, looking around, "where is he?" Elias pointed. At the edge of the landing pad. Seven was sitting like a statue, watching a group of children who had gathered behind the security fence. They were waving at him. The wolf, the former weapon of mass destruction, raised a paw and waved back. The children cheered. "He is enjoying the fame too much," Elias said. "We need to get him off-world before he starts signing autographs." Lyra smiled. It was a genuine smile, free of the shadows that had haunted her for years. She walked over to Elias. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Where are we going, Elias?" Elias looked at the star charts on his datapad. "There is a sector in the Veil Nebula, uncharted. No empires, no borders, just stars." "Sounds quiet," Lyra said. "I think we have earned quiet." Seven trotted over, sensing the departure. He looked at the ship, then at the city, then at them. He let out a soft bark, impatient. "He is ready," Lyra said. Elias looked at the woman and the wolf, his family. He thought about the cell where he had waited to die. He thought about the ice world. He thought about the fear that had dictated every moment of his life until he met them. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear write the story. And their story was just beginning. "Let us go," Elias said. They walked up the ramp together, the soldier who learned to feel, the scientist who learned to fight, and the wolf who taught them both what it meant to be human. The engines hummed to life, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a promise. The ship lifted off, rising above the towers of the capital, turning toward the open sky. They did not look back. They did not need to. The past was a closed file. The future was an open star map. As the ship pierced the atmosphere and vanished into the blue, the city below did not mourn a loss. It celebrated a beginning. And somewhere, on a frequency that only the free could hear, a wolf was howling at the stars,